Good evening. I'm Michael Hardenstein. Welcome to this session on staying quietly in your room, reflections on a pandemic. I was asked by Father Fred Robinson, who has become the editor of the Anglican Digest, to contribute an article for the summer edition of the Anglican Digest on the topic faith during times of crisis. And I thought, as I was composing this, about an editorial David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, had written in April, where he had asked his readers to send in their assessment of how they were doing during the pandemic. And a week later, he said he'd received over 5,000 replies, and he was surprised that so many people were in what he called agony. One woman, a single woman, 65 years old with no nearby family, said that I'm feeling totally alone in this crisis and hopeless. An atheist wrote that he was praying daily, but he did not know to whom. One reader said the pandemic was causing him invisible stress, a pervasive, ever-shifting, hard-to-define anxiety. And another person wrote to say there was no way to distract yourself from your unhappiness now. Now, these themes of loneliness, anxiety, and worry are certainly not unique to a current pandemic. They're themes familiar to the human experience. So there's nothing new about the anxiety so many people have reported during this crisis. The only novel thing is that so many people are experiencing the same crisis simultaneously. My question in composing the article I submitted was, is the Christian response any different in a crisis affecting so many people at the same time than it is to individual crises experienced in unique circumstances? And to answer that question, I drew on three authors that you may be familiar with. One was Blaise Pascal in his book, The Pensée. Another is the 20th century theologian Paul Tillich in his book, The Courage to Be. And lastly, the Reverend Peter Gomes, The Good Book. I commend each of these to you, although I will say that the Tillich book is not an easy read, whereas The Good Book by Peter Gomes is a very readable treatise. And Pascal, although it was written in the 1600s, is very accessible and meaningful even for today. The title of my article was Staying Quietly in Your Room. And I drew that from Pascal. And I want to read from his Pensée. And pensée in French means thoughts. Pascal, during his lifetime, would write down thoughts that he intended at one point to write into a book, but when he died, all these various thoughts were discovered after his death and compiled by his executors into this book, The Pensée. Anyway, one of his thoughts is, being unable to cure death, wretchedness, and ignorance. No, I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong thing. He wrote, I've often said that the sole cause of man's unhappiness is that he does not know how to stay quietly in his room. Why is that the case? And Pascal goes on to inform us that rest proves intolerable because of the boredom it produces. Pascal observed that though we have 1,001 basic reasons for being bored, the slightest thing, like pushing a ball with a billiard cue, will be enough to divert us. He observes, however sad a man may be, if you can persuade him to take up some diversion, he will be happy while it lasts. And however happy a man may be, if he lacks diversion and has no absorbing passion or entertainment to keep boredom away, he will soon be depressed and unhappy. So why is this loneliness and lack of diversion so bad? Why would it make us unhappy? And Pascal answers that. He says, take away our diversion, and you will see us bored to extinction. We feel our nullity without recognizing it, for nothing could be more wretched than to be intolerably depressed as soon as one is reduced to introspection with no means of diversion. So we want diversion so we don't have to be alone and have introspection. So my question is, what's so bad about introspection? And Pascal answers that question this way. When I consider the short duration of my life, swallowed up in the eternity before and after, the small space I occupy, and which I see engulfed in the infinite immensity of spaces of which I know nothing, and which know nothing of me, I am frightened. Then I marvel that so wretched a state does not drive people to despair. All I know is that I must soon die, but what I know least about is this very death which I cannot evade. Pascal observes about death. All I know is when I leave this world, I shall fall forever into nothingness or into the hands of a wrathful God. But I do not know which of these two states is to be my eternal lot. Death threatens us at every moment and must, in a few years, infallibly face us with the inescapable and appalling alternative of being annihilated or wretched throughout eternity. Let us put on as bold a face as we like. That is the end, awaiting even the world's most illustrious life. So Pascal's point is that we don't want to be alone without diversion, because if we are forced to be alone and think about our fate, we might actually worry that death, which awaits all of us inevitably, leads either into a state of annihilation and nothingness, or into the hands of a judging, wrathful God, and potential wretchedness for all of us in eternity. Peter Gomes, whose book, The Good Book, which I really can't say enough about for a good reading, makes this point. We celebrate individualism and autonomy in America, and we like to think of ourselves as beyond merely following the crowd. Yet we abhor silence, and we mass together whenever we can. we flock together and dare not be alone, lest we discover that we are not only alone, but on our own. In 1939, the poet W.H. Auden wrote this poem. The lights must never go out. The music must always play, lest we should see where we are, lost in a haunted wood, children afraid of the night, who have never been happy or good. So, cheery thoughts, aren't they? What are we to do? Pascal marveled that faced with our inevitable destiny, what keeps people from despair? And he answers that question this way. Being able to cure death, wretchedness, and ignorance, men have decided, in order to be happy, not to think about such things. And this is what I think relates to those readers who responded to David Brooks' editorial. One said that there is nothing now quarantined in her room to distract her from her unhappiness. Precisely what Pascal said 400 years ago about us if we have nothing to divert us. And so we spend endless times trying to entertain ourselves, divert ourselves, anything to actually contemplate the serious crisis that awaits us. Paul Tillich was a renowned 20th century theologian. He's often thought of as a liberal theologian, which I guess to many Redeemerites would make him disqualified as useful reading. But his book, The Courage to Be, really addresses, in a way I think no one has since Pascal, the issues related to anxiety and the importance of anxiety in faith, and I think in bringing people to faith. Now, I grew up as a Southern Baptist, where faith was belief in the Bible. And the call to faith was to believe in the Bible. What Peter Gomes says is bibliolatry, belief in a book, as opposed to belief in the one to whom the book testifies. With Tillich, he doesn't start, and frankly, neither does Pascal start, with belief or faith based on a book, but rather faith derived from the common human experience of anxiety, of uncertainty, of doubt. I want to read several things from Tillich's book. He echoes Pascal without mentioning him multiple times. He writes that it is understandable that all human life can be interpreted as a continuous attempt to avoid despair. And this attempt is mostly successful. Why? Because we divert ourselves. We don't think about this, which Pascal said. That's why we avoid despair, but we don't think about the serious nature of what we are involved in. Tillich says the anxiety, which is despair, is not always present, but the rare occasions in which it is present determine the interpretation of existence as a whole. And perhaps this is the remarkable thing about this pandemic that we've been living through, is that it has forced people to experience anxiety and to contemplate the meaninglessness or meaningfulness of their lives. Tillich says that the anxiety which is potentially present in every individual becomes general if the accustomed structures of meaning, power, belief, and order disintegrate. It sounds familiar to what we experienced in the last few months. These structures, as long as they are in force, keep anxiety bound within a protective system of courage by participation. The individual who participates in the institutions and ways of life of such a system is not liberated from his personal anxieties, but he has means of overcoming them with well-known methods. Pascal would say methods of diversion. Of Gomes says flocking together. Now, what is anxiety? Tillich offers a useful differentiation between anxiety and fear. The notable thing about fear is that fear has a discernible object. And because of that, we can deal with the object and surmount the fear. I'm afraid the tree outside my house is going to fall over in a storm and wreck my house. I can deal with that fear. I can have the tree cut down. Anxiety, however, has no object as its source. Its anxiety, by definition, has no precise object. And in fact, one of David Brooks' readers made that very point. A pervasive, ever-shifting, hard to define anxiety. Tillich says, anxiety is the state in which a being, us, is aware of its possible non-being. It's the existential awareness of non-being. That means, by existential, it's not some abstract knowledge of non-being that produces anxiety, but it's the awareness that non-being is a part of our own being. It's not the realization intellectually of the universal transitoriness. It's not the experience of death of others, but the impression of these events on the always latent awareness of our own being having to die that produces anxiety. This is the natural anxiety of man as man. It is the anxiety of non-being, the awareness of one's finitude as finitude. Tillich makes the point that this anxiety of non-being is inherent in all existence, and it cannot be eliminated. It belongs to existence itself. Tillich identifies three forms of anxiety: death, meaninglessness, and condemnation resulting from sense of guilt. The anxiety of meaninglessness, Tillich says, is anxiety about the loss of an ultimate concern, of a meaning which gives meaning to all meanings. This anxiety is aroused by the loss of a spiritual center, of an answer, however symbolic and indirect, to the question of the meaning of existence. In a world of uncertainty, where metaphysics cannot be proved, it is the spiritual center that we draw upon to give meaning to our lives. With regard to guilt and condemnation, Tillich says this anxiety threatens our own self-affirmation. Our being isn't really given to us, but is also demanded of us. We are responsible for it. Literally, we are required to answer if we are asked what we have made of ourselves. A few months ago, I taught a class on the Reformation and Luther. And Tillich has some wonderful things to say about that. He said the courage of the Reformers was not the courage to be oneself, for the courage of confidence is not rooted in confidence about oneself. The Reformation pronounces the opposite. One can become confident about one's existence only after ceasing to base one's confidence on oneself. As I mentioned in my class on Luther, Luther was tormented by his feelings of inadequacy. He was a perfect priest. He was penitent all the time, but he had this nagging feeling he could never be good enough for God. So he experienced the anxiety of guilt and condemnation, Tillich says, as the main form of anxiety. The courage to affirm oneself in spite of anxiety, this anxiety of guilt, is rooted in the personal, total, and immediate certainty of divine forgiveness. Accepting acceptance, though being unacceptable, is the basis for the courage of confidence. Echoing a point Father Charleston so frequently makes in his sermons, Tillich says, "It is not the good or the wise or the pious who are entitled to the courage to accept acceptance, but those who are lacking in all these qualities and are aware of being unacceptable." But Jesus pointed out, it is not the righteous, but the unrighteous who are aware of the need of a physician. Tillich says that in the face of our ultimate non-being, of our ultimate death, what gives us the courage to live with a sense of meaningfulness and hope? And Tillich is very clear that the courage to be can only come from the power of being itself. Now, what is that? What is the power of being? What is being? Tillich says the power of being is God. God itself, God himself, not a being, but being itself. This reminded me of Moses' encounter. When Moses was called by God to go preach to the Israelites, Moses objected and said, "Who should I tell them has sent me?" And God says, "Tell them, I am who I am has sent you." God, because Moses asked God his name, and the answer was, "I am who I am." The Hebrew can be interpreted various ways, and one way that can be interpreted is, "I am the one who exists." God is the source of all being, and it is the faith and the power of God's being that gives us the courage to affirm ourselves in all the anxieties of life. A crisis is defined often as a difficult or dangerous situation that needs serious attention. And the funny thing about the request to write about faith in a time of crisis is that when are we not in crisis? We're always in crisis. Our life is a crisis. As Pascal said, we are all we're hurtling toward this ultimate crisis of non-being. And what is our destiny? Nothing drove Pascal crazier than the smug attitude of skeptics who couldn't be bothered thinking about an eternal destiny. Or Pascal said, that ought to be our life's primary mission. We're here at such a fleeting point of time, and yet you're too busy or too unconcerned to care about what your eternal destiny might be. We all experience crises in a more acute fashion from time to time. Those instances where Tillich says we are drawn to determine the meaning of existence itself. But even when we don't feel a crisis in our lives, our life is a crisis. And the Christian gospel calls us to recognize that it is not of our own power, our own worthiness, our own righteousness, that we are accepted and deal with our anxiety and crisis. It's by our trust in the one who is being itself, who really is, who draws us near and calls us home, that gives us hope. Hope that doesn't spare us from life's exigencies, but hope which brings us through. Thank you for watching.